My daughter-in-law ordered me out after his funeral. I left, then came back to shake their world. Michael's laugh still had the same gentle crackle it did when he was a boy. He sat at the edge of the couch now, a coffee cup balanced neatly in his hands, his smile polite and distant. Sarah sat beside him, legs crossed, her posture straight as ever. She nodded encouragingly when Michael mentioned something about the old backyard swing, her hand brushing his sleeve like punctuation. I smiled too, though it didn't quite reach my chest. The living room was sunlit, warm, open, but still it felt smaller than I remembered. A breeze from the cracked window stirred the edge of the lace curtain, brushing gently against the frame of John's photograph on the mantel. Sarah glanced at it, just a moment. But I caught the flicker in her eye, quick and dismissive, as if she were silently suggesting it might be time to redecorate. John's chair stood empty between us. Always his chair. The brown leather had dulled, and the cushions sagged where his weight once settled after long days at the shop. No one sat in it now. Not out of reverence, I sensed, but avoidance. Sarah brought coffee in white mugs with tiny blue flowers. Not the ones I used to keep for guests, the heavier stoneware. She passed mine with a faint smile and settled the sugar jar just out of my reach. I leaned forward to fetch it without saying a word. Michael had grown into his father's shoulders but not his steadiness. His eyes flitted too much, and when I asked if he'd had a chance to visit the workshop lately, John's old landscaping office, he only murmured that Sarah had been keeping him busy with the books and billing. Sarah smiled again. It's been a lot, but I like having him closer to home. I nodded. The photo on the mantel watched quietly. After a moment, I asked if they'd like to go through the old garden tools this weekend, see what needed oiling, what might still be useful. I kept my tone light. Sarah answered before Michael could. Oh, I think we're out Saturday. Weren't we, Mike? Sunday might be too tight, too. He looked at her, then at me. Yeah, maybe another time, Mom. Another time. The changes came slowly, like fog inching in over the water. Quiet, soft-edged, but thick enough to blur the familiar lines. Sarah began doing the grocery runs alone, despite our shared list pinned neatly on the fridge. She used to ask if I needed anything, if I preferred the fig jam John liked or the rye crackers I always kept for soup nights. Lately, she returned with items I didn't recognize. Spicy oat milk. Coconut yogurt. The jam vanished. The crackers stopped appearing. At first, I told myself it was forgetfulness. She was busy. Life was shifting. But then she laughed, lightly, almost fondly, when I mentioned it. Oh, Emily, do you still eat that stuff? I thought you'd moved on. There was no malice in her voice. Only casual dismissal. It stung more that way. My mornings grew heavier. I woke earlier, instinctively. The creak of floorboards under my slippers was the only sound until they came downstairs, Sarah with her tablet in hand, Michael trailing behind, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. They didn't say much. They kissed each other absent-mindedly and scrolled through their screens while I made coffee. It used to be the other way around. I used to pour and wait for them. Now, I poured for myself. By the second week of March, the chores began shifting. A little here, a little there. Sarah asked if I wouldn't mind running a few loads of laundry, only while ours is backed up. Then it became the dishes, the floors. Then Toby's school lunches when Sarah was slammed with calls. I made them quietly, stacking carrot sticks and little notes inside, pretending he'd know who wrote them. Michael never thanked me. Sometimes, I found myself whispering to John when the house was quiet. Just small things, like I used to. The lilacs will bloom late this year, or you wouldn't believe the price of eggs. Just to say them. Just to imagine his nod. One Sunday afternoon, I asked Michael if I could sort through John's tools. His hands were deep in the sink, scrubbing a plate half-heartedly. The ones in the garage? He asked without turning. I said yes. I'd been thinking of donating some to the high school's gardening program. Maybe oiling the pruners. Maybe finding that little brass trowel John loved. He shrugged. Let's talk about it later, Mom. We didn't talk about it later. The shed stayed locked. That night, I stood at the kitchen window long after the dishes were done, watching the porch light flicker. The wind was low. I could hear the faint chime of the wind sculpture John had welded from scrap metal, bent copper and old spade handles. It made a soft, sad sound, like memory. I hadn't felt like myself in months, but I didn't know what that even meant anymore. A few days later, I overheard Sarah on the phone with someone, a friend or a colleague, her voice smooth and low. She said something about how the house doesn't breathe right with 3 adults, and then laughed. Michael was out that night. He never mentioned the call. And still, I stayed. I cooked. I watered the porch plants. I picked up the dry cleaning when the tags grew stiff. I smiled when Toby showed me his Lego creations and told him his imagination would make John proud. But inside, something was thinning, like fabric worn too long in one place. Then came the memorial. It was for John's old business partner, Pete. He'd passed away in January, and his wife held a modest ceremony near the community park where the two of them once planted a row of sugar maples. It wasn't a funeral, it was a gathering. Old faces, soft music, stories. I wore a navy dress John always said made me look strong. Michael barely spoke that day. He stood beside me, but his mind drifted elsewhere. It was Sarah who spoke, when she leaned in and whispered something to him while Pete's son gave a short speech. Her voice was soft, but not quiet enough. "This house is too much for Mom now," she said. Michael looked at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. Just once. I didn't say a word. We drove home in silence. The roads were clear, the sky the color of chalk. Michael dropped me at the curb, said he needed to grab a few things. Sarah stayed in the car, staring straight ahead. I stood there for a long time after they left. That night, I went to the basement and found the old cedar chest John kept beneath the stairs. I opened it with the small brass key he'd hidden behind the water heater. Inside were winter quilts, some faded tax records, and an envelope with my name on it. Inside the envelope was a key. The cottage. John's childhood friend, Helen, had given it to us after she moved to Florida, "For when you need to breathe," she'd said. I held the key in my palm for a long time, then wrapped it in a handkerchief and tucked it into my coat pocket. The next morning, I left a note on the fridge. Gone to Helen's for a few days. No need to call. Then I drove north. The cottage sat at the end of a gravel lane, flanked by pine and oak, its green roof still holding patches of last winter's snow. John had painted that roof himself, years ago, on a borrowed ladder with a half-empty can of sealant. The lake was still frozen in places, though the middle had begun to darken, spring pushing in. I stepped out of the car and stood for a while, just listening. No engines. No phones. Just the slow creak of branches and the soft whisper of wind against the shutters. The key fit easily. The door opened on the first try. Inside, it smelled of cedar and dust. The kind of smell that doesn't leave a place, no matter how long it's been empty. I set my suitcase down by the door, not bothering to unpack. I didn't need much. A coat, some notebooks, my tea canister, and the file folder I had carried with me in silence for so long. For 3 days, I moved slowly. I sat near the window with my coffee in the mornings, watching ice break away from the shoreline like old promises. I found an old wool throw in the chest by the sofa, one John used to nap under during long weekends. It still held the faint scent of wood smoke. In the evenings, I lit the little iron stove and read by oil lamp. No one called. No one came. And I didn't miss the sound of the city. I didn't miss the polite silences or Sarah's too sweet voice. I didn't miss Michael's indifference, his shoulder shrugs that had begun to feel like brick walls. Instead, I remembered the way John used to pace the living room floor, muttering about soil quality and truck maintenance. The sound of his boots clunking in the mudroom. The way he spoke about the company like it was a living thing, his shop, his crew, his clients. A legacy, he called it. And I remembered something else. The conversation we had the fall before he died. We had been sitting on this very porch, wrapped in blankets, the air sharp with frost. He had just renewed some company documents, and he mentioned, so casually it barely registered, that he'd moved everything into a trust. Just makes things easier, he'd said. And you're the only one I trust with it. You understand the heart of it. At the time, I'd nodded. I was tired. I didn't ask for details. But now, the weight of those words came back to me like a tide I hadn't noticed rising. I opened the file folder that night. Inside were copies of legal documents John had left in our shared safety box at the bank. I'd asked for them 2 months after his passing, when Michael seemed so eager to take on the operations side. He said it was his way of honoring John. But I had never signed anything. I hadn't needed to. The papers told the truth. The company, every last truck and mower and contract, had been placed into a living trust, one that named me sole beneficiary. There were also signed family loan agreements, $112,000 in total, that Michael had pulled from the company accounts since John's death. All under the guise of startup ventures and transitional support. John had signed off on the first one. The rest? Michael had signed himself. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the stove, the folder open on my knees, watching the flames curve against the iron. I felt no rage. Only clarity. This wasn't about business. It wasn't even about betrayal. It was about choice. About agency. About not being written out of my own life. By morning, I knew what I needed to do. I packed lightly, left the key under the ceramic turtle by the porch steps, just where Helen used to hide it, and drove home through soft fog and silence. When I stepped through the front door, Michael looked up from the dining table. Sarah was beside him, tapping on her laptop. Neither of them stood. "Mom," Michael said, guarded. "We didn't know you were coming back today." "I didn't know either," I said, removing my coat and hanging it with calm precision. "But the weather held, so here I am." Sarah offered a brief smile. "We were just going over some spring contracts for the business." "Michael's been so swamped." "I'm sure," I replied. I moved to the sideboard and placed the file folder down gently. The same folder John had carried under his arm on more than one occasion. They recognized it. Michael paled. "I'd like to go over something with you both," I said, my voice low but steady. No anger. Just clarity. They said nothing. I opened the folder and laid out the documents, one by one. The trust agreement. The company ownership. The notarized statements. The signed loans. Sarah's breath caught as she scanned the pages. "You see," I said quietly, "John protected the business. He protected me. You've both known that, deep down. And now it's time we treated accordingly." Michael opened his mouth, but no words came. Sarah recovered first. "Emily, we didn't mean to overstep. We assumed, well, we thought everything would transition naturally. Michael has the experience. He's been running the books." "No," I said. "He's been withdrawing from them." I closed the folder. "Not with force, just finality." "I won't be pushed out of my home," I said, "or from the business John protected me with. I won't sign anything. I won't leave quietly. Not this time." Michael's shoulders slumped. Sarah looked toward the floor. "I hope," I said gently, "you'll still choose to be my family." Then I turned and walked into the sunlit hallway, leaving their silence behind. The days that followed unfolded without ceremony. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just a new stillness in the house, the kind that comes after a long winter storm when even the trees hesitate to breathe. Sarah began rising earlier than usual, leaving the kitchen before I entered. The air still smelled faintly of her expensive perfume, sweet and distant, like something bought in a shop that didn't welcome questions. Michael lingered in his office most days, the door barely open. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His silence told me everything. They were recalibrating. I, on the other hand, found a rhythm again. Quiet, steady. I walked through John's old office each morning with a notepad in hand. I straightened things, rewrote labels, made calls to clients who had stopped hearing from us when Michael took over the books. Their voices warmed when they heard mine, familiar, grateful. One even asked if I was coming back full-time. Something like that, I said, a small smile in my voice. By the end of the week, I had called Dave. He'd been John's right hand for 22 years, short, stocky, a sun-scorched face and kind, quiet eyes. I told him I was stepping back in. About time, he said, not unkindly. I still run the cruise, Mrs. Bell. But truth be told, the last few months have felt rudderless. We met 2 days later in the greenhouse behind the workshop. Dust hung in beams of light through the old windows, and the air smelled of damp earth and faded fertilizer. I'd like to learn, I said. Not just the books. The roots. The grafting. The soil composition. Dave nodded, his eyes scanning the space as though weighing something he'd kept folded away too long. John always said you were the heart of this place. We all knew. Even if you never touched a shovel. I didn't correct him. I didn't need to. The loft above the workshop had once been used for storage, a few rusted tools, faded tarps, a moth-eaten armchair. It took me 3 days to clear it, another 2 to scrub the floorboards and open every window wide. The sunlight flooded in like relief. On the 6th day, I moved in. No announcement. No confrontation. I left the house key on the kitchen counter in a small blue dish I'd once used for garden seeds. Michael didn't stop me. Neither did Sarah. They stood in the hallway when I passed, both holding coffee cups, both stunned into a kind of polite paralysis. Sarah asked, "You're really leaving?" "I am," I said. "Where will you stay?" Michael asked, though he already knew. "Somewhere that doesn't ask me to disappear." Then I stepped out the front door and didn't look back. Life above the shop was quiet but full. I kept fresh herbs in the windowsill, rosemary, thyme, a stubborn mint plant that refused to be tamed. I painted one of the old wooden chairs sea green, just because I could. In the mornings, I opened every window and listened to the wind move through the trees. Clients returned. New ones came. Dave introduced me as Mrs. Bell, the boss, and though I laughed at first, I let the words stand. I didn't tell anyone what Sarah had said. I didn't remind Michael of his nod. They already knew. Weeks passed. Spring melted fully into summer. I learned the difference between Japanese and sugar maples. I sketched new designs for shaded gardens, answered emails, visited clients, and started to understand the balance between sunlight and root depth. And then, the call came. Sarah's voice on the line was sweet. Too sweet. "Emily," she said, "I was wondering if you'd be open to me helping out with client events. You know, scheduling, maybe some outreach?" I paused, letting silence fill the space between us. It stretched just long enough to make her voice crack slightly. I know I didn't. I mean, we didn't always handle things well. But I'd been thinking a lot about how to make things right. For the family. For the business. It could be good to have a fresh face, just a little help. I thanked her and told her I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. The next day, flowers arrived at the shop. No card. But the handwriting on the delivery slip was unmistakably Michael's. I placed them in the corner near the sink, out of direct sunlight, out of sight. That evening, I walked to the lake alone. The air was warm. A few dragonflies skimmed the surface. I sat on the dock, feet just above the water, the old key from Helen's cottage now resting on a chain around my neck. A reminder. Of breath. Of boundaries. Of becoming whole. When I returned to the loft, I turned off my phone and tucked it into the drawer beneath the kettle. Then I stood for a while in the greenhouse, watching the moonlight filter through the stained glass I'd installed last week, a gift to myself. The leaves whispered against the glass like an answer. I wasn't lonely. I was simply no longer theirs to discard. Summer lingered long that year, holding back autumn with stubborn heat and a sky the color of burnished copper. The business was busier than it had been in years. Clients returned with fresh enthusiasm, and Dave, steady, reliable Dave, became both my anchor and compass. He handled the crews, and I managed the rest. Our rhythm was simple: early mornings, thoughtful meetings, and an unspoken trust. Each day brought new calm. I designed garden plans at the wide drafting table John once used for invoices. I learned to navigate supply orders and maintenance logs. I even took over the payroll, noting which employees had been with us through every storm and which had drifted in more recently under Michael's watch. A few needed letting go. Others, I brought closer. My hands, once used to folding laundry and pouring coffee for indifferent ears, were now ink-stained from sketching soil maps. I wore gloves sometimes, but more often I didn't. The dirt reminded me of who I had always been beneath the roles others had cast me in. The loft, with its cracked window panes and oil-smudged beams, began to feel like home. I added a small table by the window and placed my mother's china teacup there, just one. No set. No expectation of company. I brewed chamomile in the evenings and sat watching the sky fold itself into dusk. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the bell on the front door of the shop rang with a sharper chime than usual. Sarah stood there in a navy blazer and flats far too clean for our gravel drive. Her expression was curated, somewhere between apology and performance. She held a folder under one arm and a slight smile under her eyes. "I thought we might talk," she said. I nodded slowly and led her to the bench behind the greenhouse. She spoke first. Polished sentences about misunderstanding, family, the burden of grief. She mentioned how hard Michael had taken John's passing, how unprepared they'd both felt stepping into such a large role. She referred to my move as an adjustment, and to the trust as a surprise we hadn't fully grasped. I listened. I let her finish. Then I spoke, softly but clearly. "Sarah, I was never confused. I was erased." Her mouth opened, but I raised one hand. "I was pushed from the home I built. From the space John and I spent decades tending. From our porch. Our kitchen. I was asked to fade quietly. And when I didn't, the strategy changed. You spoke to Michael about space, about me being too much. You said it in a whisper at a memorial. I heard it." She looked down, her hands tightening around the folder. "I didn't come here to scold," I continued. "I came back to remember who I was before I let you both define me by usefulness." "I never meant," she started, but the words fell apart. I stood then, gently brushing soil from my palms. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done. The business belongs to me. Legally. Practically. Historically. It will remain in my care." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "What about Michael? This is all he has." "No," I said. "This is what he borrowed. And what he tried to take without understanding." She said nothing. The folder stayed closed in her lap. "I hope," I added after a pause, "that you both find something that truly belongs to you. Something you build." And then I walked back into the greenhouse. Later that evening, I found the folder on the bench. She'd left it there, unopened. Inside were copies of unpaid invoices, supplier notes, and a draft of an event flyer titled, "Bell and Son Garden Design." I placed it carefully in the recycling bin and did not look back. That night, the wind picked up across the fields, and the leaves began to turn for the first time in months. A signal. Not an ending, but a transition. Not loss, but shedding. The next morning, I ordered new business cards. Just one name, Emily Bell, proprietor. The first autumn frost came in quiet, silvery layers, tracing the garden beds with fine white lace. The perennials wilted into sleep, and the air turned sharper in the mornings. I began rising before sunrise, making tea and lighting the small stove, its warmth spreading slowly across the wooden floor of the loft. I liked the quiet. It asked nothing of me. It didn't prod or weigh or negotiate. It simply was. Business slowed as the leaves fell. Dave shifted to winter prep, trimming, storing tools, wrapping saplings in burlap. We spoke less often, but his presence remained like the steady tick of a trusted clock. I spent more time in the greenhouse, organizing, taking notes, sketching new ideas for spring. I'd found John's old ledger, his scrawl rough and practical, and begun updating it in my own hand. I wrote cleaner, with smaller letters, but the spirit stayed the same. Then, one gray Thursday, Michael appeared. Not at the house. Not in the shop. But here, at the greenhouse door, hands deep in his coat pockets, eyes shaded by regret. I didn't open the door right away. I let him wait. When I did, I stepped out slowly, tea in hand. He looked thinner, like someone who had lost sleep and couldn't name why. His voice was soft. "Mom, I wanted to talk." I nodded toward the bench beneath the cedar. The same one Sarah had occupied weeks before. He sat without a word. "I've been thinking a lot," he said. "About how things happened. What I let happen." The tea in my hand steamed upward, silent. "I know I didn't protect you," he said. "I thought I was. I don't know. Balancing things. Sarah has always been strong, and I thought, if I just kept the peace, maybe everything would settle. But it didn't. And I see that now." I didn't interrupt. "I miss Dad," he added. I thought I was honoring him by keeping the business going. But I didn't really see what he built. "Not until you stepped back in." That sentence sat between us like a line in the dirt. "I wasn't asking to run things," I said. "I was asking not to be erased." Michael looked away, his eyes glassy. "I know." I waited. Let the wind blow through the turning trees. "I owe you more than I can say," he finally whispered. "Not just for the money, or the trust, or the business, but for staying. For not vanishing when I made it so easy." He pulled a small envelope from his coat. "I've spoken with a lawyer," he said. "I've signed a full release of claim to the company. I wanted to do that, without you having to ask." He handed it to me. I didn't open it. "I also returned the full client list to the company server," he continued. "And the credit cards we used under the business name, they're cancelled." Still, I said nothing. He stood, his hands still deep in his pockets. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just wanted to tell you. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope, someday, maybe, I can still be your son." Then he walked away. I stayed seated for a long time. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I sat by the stove and reread John's ledger. Then I opened a new notebook, carefully dated the first page, and wrote in clean, quiet script. "Company restructure, autumn plan." I made lists. Not of debts, or wrongs, or losses. Of seedlings. Of repairs. Of improvements. Of hope. 3 days later, Rebecca called. Her voice was bright but uncertain. "Grandma? Mom says you've been busy. I didn't want to bother you." "You're never a bother," I said. She exhaled. "I miss you." "I miss you too." I was wondering, she hesitated, could I help with the greenhouse sometime? "I need volunteer hours for school." I smiled, unseen. "Of course. Come Saturday. Bring gloves." And she did. She arrived early, with an old thermos and her hair tied back like I used to wear mine. She didn't ask about her parents. I didn't bring them up. We trimmed vines. We pulled weeds. We spoke in gentle fragments, books she was reading, classes she liked, the sound of owls at night. At one point, she looked up from the soil and said, it's really beautiful here, Grandma. I looked around, at the cracked glass, the leaning shelf, the moss creeping up the stone wall. It's growing, I said. And we left it at that. Later that evening, as I washed my hands at the basin, I caught my reflection in the pane of glass above the sink. There were lines in my face that hadn't been there before. Silver in my hair that no dye could smooth. But my eyes, those were mine again. Not grateful. Not afraid. Present. A gust of wind outside stirred the hanging chimes, and I whispered, just once, to no one and everyone. I'm still here. And the sound rang back like an answer. The loft was quiet that evening as I poured tea and looked out across the fields where the crews were finishing a late project. Dave waved from a distance, and I waved back. John's wind chime rang gently behind me. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply breathed. The first snow came before the forecast had time to warn us. Fine, whispering flakes that turned the shop roof white by mid-afternoon and settled softly on the greenhouse's glass panels. I watched it fall from the loft's east window, my tea cooling in my hands. Down below, Dave called the crews in early, the low whir of trucks backing into the lot, laughter muffled by gloves and scarves. Inside, it was warm. The stove crackled steadily, and I'd pulled the heavy wool curtains across the back windows, the ones I had hemmed myself from old quilts. The loft smelled of dried eucalyptus and rosemary from the bundles Rebecca and I had hung to cure 2 weeks earlier. She came every Saturday now. No more talk of volunteer hours. Just her and a backpack, and sometimes her sketchbook, where she quietly drew seed pods and curling vines. She never asked if she was welcome. She just showed up, and I always had a mug ready for her. It was Rebecca who told me about Sarah's new job. She's working with a property staging company now, she said one afternoon while pruning the old lemon balm. She says it's more creative freedom and less stress. I didn't respond. I just nodded and handed her the basket for clippings. And Dad, she trailed off. He's been quiet. He goes on long walks. Sometimes he just sits on the porch in the cold. Again, I said nothing. Rebecca didn't press. Some truths only bloom in silence. What I didn't tell her was that I had received another letter from Michael. Not handwritten, he was never one for pens, but carefully typed, folded into thirds. It was waiting in the shop mailbox one morning, tucked between catalogs and mulch samples. In it, he said thank you. That was all. Just a quiet, unsentimental thank you. For the business. For my presence. For the chance to begin again even if not beside me. I kept it in the back of my ledger. Not forgiven. Not forgotten. But kept. Winter deepened. The lake froze in soft concentric rings, and the trees around the property turned brittle and still. Inside, I began rearranging the greenhouse for seed starting, new trays, warmer soil mixes, gentle lights strung overhead. Rebecca brought an old desk lamp from her bedroom. For the basil, she said. It hates the dark. We made labels by hand. I slept well, for the first time in years. Not from exhaustion, but peace. The loft creaked in the night, but it was a kind creak, with settling, not breaking. Some mornings, I still reached for John's old cardigan hanging by the door. It no longer carried his scent, but the weight of it was comforting, like memory worn soft at the seams. I wore it while walking the rows behind the greenhouse, marking what might be moved, what needed rest. The world felt slow, and that slowness felt earned. Then one morning, after a long night of snow, I found a package on the shop steps. No name. Just a brown parcel tied with string. Inside, a leather-bound book. A field guide to native plants of the Northeast. And inside the front cover, a note in Michael's blocky handwriting. For when spring comes. I closed it, quietly. Placed it on the shelf. Left the string folded neatly beside the kettle. Weeks passed. The greenhouse bloomed again, rows of small, stubborn life pushing up through the thaw. Rebecca helped start the tomatoes. We painted signs. We moved the lemon balm outside and watched it twitch in the breeze. No one mentioned Sarah again. Michael texted twice more. Brief things. Updates. Photos of the dog he'd adopted. A picture of Toby beside a snowman. I responded once, "Thank you for the book." Nothing more. Because something in me had changed, not into anger, not into bitterness, but into something firmer. Not hard, but unmoving. This was my home now. Not just the loft or the shop or the earth beneath the trees, but the space I had made by not disappearing. The choice I made when I refused to be written out. Some days, I still heard echoes, Sarah's careful tone, Michael's clipped replies. But they didn't own me anymore. Their voices were wind in distant trees. That spring, I planted tulips in the shape of a circle just beyond the greenhouse. John always loved circles. No corners to crowd you in, he used to say. And on the morning they bloomed, bright yellow, patient, and wide, I sat in the center with my tea and whispered one word. Enough. Not in resignation. In release. It had always been enough. I had always been enough. By early April, the greenhouse was a cathedral of green. Seedlings pressed against their plastic domes, and tiny roots threaded through black soil like pale threads of hope. Rebecca was there nearly every afternoon now, her hands quick and competent. She didn't ask questions she didn't need answers to. We moved around each other with the kind of ease that only comes when affection is no longer dependent on understanding. One evening, while labeling trays of lavender and marigold, she asked gently, "Will you ever go back to the house?" I paused, letting my hands rest on the edge of the table. "No," I said. "It's not a home anymore. It's a place that kept asking me to shrink." She didn't speak for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I never liked how Mom talked to you. Even when I was little, I felt it." I looked at her, startled not by the words but by the quiet conviction behind them. "She made me feel small too, sometimes," she added. I reached over, gently touched her wrist. "You never were." She smiled, and we returned to our work. Later that night, after she left, I found myself standing by the greenhouse door, watching the last of the sun settle across the hills. I thought of the early days, how I used to hold my breath walking through the front door of Michael's house, how I'd hoped, naively, that love would be enough to keep me tethered to people who had already begun to loosen the threads. But here, there was no performance. No measuring. Only the rhythm of growth. That same week, I began meeting with a local community group, gardeners and small business owners who were trying to bring more green spaces to the neighborhood park. John had once drawn plans for that same park. I found his old sketches in the bottom drawer of the workshop desk, water-stained but intact. I brought them to the meeting. The group welcomed me quietly. Not as a widow or someone's mother, but as someone with knowledge, with vision. We walked the park grounds together one breezy morning, my boots sinking gently into the damp soil, my hand resting on the sketch pad as I showed them where a walking path could curve through native shrubs, how the trees might be spaced to offer shade without blocking the sky. Someone asked, "How long have you done this?" And I smiled. "Not long at all. But I've been watching it happen my whole life." That afternoon, I returned to the loft and dusted the old corner shelf by the stove. I placed the sketch pad there, next to John's ledger, and added a new label to the top, Community Designs. The loft was no longer a refuge. It was a base. Michael hadn't called in a while. His last message had been short, something about an old truck from the business he wanted to buy back from the company. I forwarded it to Dave, along with a note, "If it's still running, let him purchase it at market rate." Nothing less. Sarah remained silent. I imagined her moving through their house, still freshly painted, with its curated throw pillows and politely spaced furniture. Maybe she'd found peace. Maybe she hadn't. But I no longer needed to know. That spring, I attended a local vendor fair for small landscaping businesses. We set up a booth, just me and Dave and Rebecca, and displayed our designs, our photos, our seedling kits. People lingered longer than I expected. They asked questions. They took cards. They smiled with their whole faces. One woman said, "You run this place?" And I said, "Yes. I do." Later, Rebecca nudged me gently. "Grandma, you're kind of a big deal." I laughed, a real one. At the end of the fair, as we packed up the table and folded the canvas sign, I paused to look at the name stitched across the fabric. Bell Garden and Design. No and Son. No borrowed legacy. Just mine. The next morning, I woke early and stepped barefoot into the greenhouse. The glass was fogged with warmth, the basil thriving under the desk lamp Rebecca had brought. The tulip bed outside had begun its second round, red ones this time, bold and unshy. I picked one and carried it inside. I placed it in a small mason jar on the windowsill. No fanfare. No photographs. Just a quiet note, penciled on the back of an old receipt and tucked beside the jar. "We bloom because we stayed." Then I turned back to the stove, filled the kettle, and watched the steam rise like a promise. Summer returned, softer than the last, less urgent, more forgiving. The loft stayed warm well into the evening, and I began sleeping with the windows open again. The wind came gently now, without the sharpness of winter or the damp scent of early spring. Just warmth, and the scent of cut grass from the workshop yard. Rebecca still came every Saturday. But she had started arriving earlier, sometimes with a friend in tow, a quiet boy with shaggy hair who always asked if it was okay to sit in the shade while they worked. I told him yes, of course. And I meant it. The greenhouse had taken on a new rhythm too. More volunteers from the community project came each week, helping to transplant seedlings, trim the vines, and plan out the beds for the park redesign. One of them, a retired mailman named Harold, asked if we might consider adding a memory garden near the southern slope. "For people to leave notes," he said. "Or names. Quiet ones. Doesn't need to be much." I said yes. We cleared the space in early June. Planted it with white alyssum, a small wooden bench at the center, and a smooth stone table with a little sign, "Leave something if you need to." By the end of the week, it held 3 pressed flowers, a small shell, and a folded note weighted with a pebble. No one disturbed them. I began walking there in the evenings. Sometimes I sat and didn't think at all. Other times I let old voices return. John's. My mother's. Even Michael's. They didn't crowd me anymore. They just came and passed like shadows through curtains. One night, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, a car pulled into the gravel drive. I watched from the greenhouse door as Michael stepped out, slow and uncertain. He didn't come to the loft. He walked instead to the memory garden, sat on the bench, and stared out across the southern slope. I didn't go to him. He stayed for an hour. Then left. Later, I found a note folded neatly on the bench. It was written in his handwriting. For what I didn't say. For what I didn't stop. I see it now. I'm sorry. I placed it inside a mason jar and left it on the shelf beside John's ledger. Not forgiven. But held. By July, the community park project was underway. Rebecca took photographs, drew sketches, even designed a pamphlet. She had a voice now, in meetings, in planning, in herself. She still called me Grandma, but she spoke to me as an equal. One morning, after repotting marigolds, she asked, "Do you miss the way things were?" I thought for a long time before answering. "No," I said. "But I remember them." She nodded. That afternoon, I rearranged the old photos in the loft. Not erased, just reframed. A wedding photo, one of John in the truck bed, Rebecca as a toddler sitting in the soil. I placed them beside newer ones, Rebecca sketching a garden bed, the community group gathered in the greenhouse, a picture Dave took of me planting the first tulip that spring. The past didn't disappear. It simply stopped defining the walls. That evening, Sarah called. The screen lit up twice. Then a third time. I let it ring. No message followed. Just silence. I turned off the phone and returned to my tea. I no longer needed to open old doors just because someone knocked. Instead, I sat by the window, a fresh draft stirring the leaves of the basil pot, and I wrote a short note to myself in the ledger. Next spring, add snapdragons near the entrance. Yellow ones. The bold kind. Later that night, I stood by the open door of the greenhouse, a lantern swinging slightly in the breeze. Across the yard, the memory garden glowed gently under moonlight. Not a monument. Not a wound. Just a place where silence was finally allowed to speak. The air smelled like soil after rain, earthy, sharp, alive. I stood inside the greenhouse early that morning, the light slanting in through the stained glass I'd mounted months ago. The colors danced on the floor, pale green and amber, tracing across the seed trays like quiet applause. The tulips outside had begun their slow bend towards summer, petals softening, color fading just a little. The basil was leggy. The thyme had gone woody. Things had shifted, as they always do. I walked the rows slowly, my fingertips grazing leaf edges, soil ridges, the rim of a watering can John had patched once with copper wire. Dave was out back, checking the delivery truck. Rebecca was at the park, coordinating benches for the new trail path. I could hear the faint murmur of voices and tools. Inside, it was just me. And it felt right. I moved to the far wall of the greenhouse where the corkboard hung. Pushpinned to it were our plans, Rebecca's sketches, community planting calendars. But also, tucked along the bottom edge, were small scraps, paper napkins, torn receipts, garden tags, with handwritten notes from visitors to the memory garden. For my sister, who loved lavender. I forgive myself today. He said sorry in spring. I believe him in fall. They were small things. Honest things. And they didn't ask to be read aloud. Next to them, I placed my own. Not a story. Not a complaint. Just, I stayed. Then I walked out of the greenhouse and into the morning. The loft was quiet when I returned. The kettle still warm. The air held the scent of mint from a bundle hanging above the sink. I took out the small journal I kept in the drawer and wrote a single line. No one gets to finish your story but you. After tea, I walked through the shop one more time, pausing beside the pegboard where John had kept his tools. I hadn't changed the arrangement. It wasn't reverence, just efficiency. He always said, put things where your hand knows they'll be. My hand still remembered. Before noon, Rebecca returned. Dirt on her jeans, wind in her hair, a camera slung across her shoulder. She grinned as she stepped inside. We finished the path, she said. Harold cried a little. I would have too, I said. She handed me a photo, a print from her camera. The new garden bench in sunlight, petals scattered around it, a shadow falling across the trail just right. Can I frame it? She asked. Yes. We worked together for a while, quiet again. When she left, I sat on the front step, the sun warm against the stone. The memory garden sat just in view. The wind moved through it gently. My phone buzzed once beside me. A message from Michael. Thinking of you. Hope the garden's blooming. I let it sit unread. Because it didn't matter what they thought anymore. Not him. Not Sarah. Not the neighbors who watched me leave that house without questions. Because I had answered my own. I didn't need a reckoning. I needed room. And I had found it. As the wind stirred the edges of my cardigan and the sun crept across the floorboards behind me, I whispered one last thing into the quiet. I'm not the guest in someone else's story anymore. The leaves rustled in reply. And that was enough.